will start. There may be some people coming later. We take this trouble with the recording because we will place the lectures and the lecture notes on the site of the Institute afterwards, where they will be freely available for student and other use. So the purpose of why I sit still and why we have to take time for the recording is so that there will be a properly produced set of lectures available on the web afterwards. Forever. It's a very interesting reflection that what goes up on the web is there forever. This deserves more contemplation than it gets. You think what is then available for future generations to read what we achieved in ours. Anyway, secondly, as you know, there is a lecture sheet that goes with every lecture, and there is a correspondence between what I say and what is on the sheet. So the idea is, of course, that the sheet is an aide-memoire for you about what is being said in the lecture, but also includes spellings of words into people's names. I think particularly people's names is essential. But a lot of people talk in foreign languages without making it clear that they're using people's names. And I, for one, can almost never hear names in a language which is not my own. I just do not know what name has been said. So hence I have a sheet. There are in fact not many names because I'm talking more about concepts than people. But today I want to talk about the humanities. And along the way, in order to explain this word and talk about its usages, I have to make clear words like human, humane, humanity, humanist and humanitarian. And I will make these words clear today. Look, very straightforwardly, the humanities in modern English usage is more or less equivalent to Humanitären. It is the if you translate Humanitären into English, you get the humanities. And you will recall from the last lecture that there are reasons why the English do not use sciences in this context, in the way that the Russian does. Now, the humanities is the common term now in the English-speaking world for that group of disciplines which are not the natural sciences and not the social sciences. Hence, you hear phrases very commonly in contemporary politics of Britain or the United States that the humanities are under threat. That is, there is said to be an area of scholarly activity called the humanities, which is threatened by withdrawal of funding above all. And people contrast the funds, the money available for the sciences with the money available for the humanities. And of course, the money available for the humanities is extremely small in comparison to the money available for the sciences. And this is normal language of ordinary, everyday political life in the English-speaking world. Now, what are the humanities? What disciplines do they actually include? And I think you could group together, as a matter of fact, the study of languages, ancient and modern, literature and art studies of all kinds, philosophy, usually it includes history. It certainly includes cultural studies, what we would call culturologia, and it often includes, because nobody knows where else to put it, the study of theology and divinity. This is a historical consequence of the marginalisation of this area of study within the university. It belongs, there's nowhere else to put it, with the humanities. Now, in practice, sometimes, in some administrations, the humanities also includes the social sciences and the psychological sciences. If it does, that's just a matter of convenience. It has no deep meaning. But it is more normal for university administrations to divide disciplines into the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. Hence, in Britain at present, there is an attempt to defend the humanities, to explain politically and to the public why they are important. And as part of this defence, there is a current festival, or will be in November, a week-long festival of the humanities, in which there will be public performances, public lectures, radio, television discussions, a whole series of venues in which the intelligent and the good attempt to explain to the wider public why there should be funding for the humanities. And very interestingly for me, the title of this festival, which is in support of the humanities, is called Being Human. And as you know, I've written a book called Being Human, translated and published here as Buit Chirivecum. And it is striking to me that the title that I chose some 7-8 years ago has now become the fashionable buzzword for saying why the humanities matter. That is, the humanities are about what it is to be human. And this, I want to explain the origins of the word and its usage in relation to this notion that you can only understand the nature of the humanities when you understand that it is the study of what it is to be a person, based upon historical examples and precedents. So, we have the United Kingdom's first festival of the humanities, Being Human. Quote, from poetry to philosophy, law to languages, classics to cultural studies, history to human rights, the programme demonstrates how research in the humanities can inform and ignite our contemporary thinking and imagination. Humanities can inform and ignite, that is, set light to our contemporary thinking and imagination. The words chosen to say why the humanities matter. Note the search for public justification for increasing thinking and imagination. It has to be argued for in the contemporary world. Something that many educated people might wish could be taken for granted. Of course, thinking and imagination is of value. Is now something that has to be argued for. And the means and disciplines through which it is argued for are the humanities disciplines. And note the contrast that is implied here. You don't argue for the sciences because of thinking and imagination. They are useful. And the contrast in the English-speaking world is between the usefulness of the natural sciences and the thinking and imaginative capacity of the humanities, which has to be argued for. They do not obviously have use. And this is, of course, the political problem. Now, the reference to the humanities for this cluster of disciplines, separate from natural science and social science, is modern. It is 20th century. It is particularly influenced by customs in the United States. It is proved, it has been adopted because it has administrative convenience. And you do not find groupings of disciplines called the humanities before the 20th century. So, let me move backwards and talk about the roots of this usage, this word usage. I think it's in fact philosophically very interesting, and I'll try and say why. Of course, the root of the word, the humanities, is the same root as human. That is the Latin word humanitas, passed into medieval French as humane. And note that in French it's still perfectly common to talk about les sciences humaines in a way that's not English. And the background to the use of the word humanities is, of course, the collective terms human and humanity. And humanity is simply equivalent to what would once in English have been straightforwardly called man, or mankind, or in German it's known as Menschheit, when Russians Человек and Человечество. But the word humanity has largely replaced the word mankind in English because of gendered connotations of the word man. It's more convenient and more comfortable to talk about humanity rather than man. Though until the mid-20th century, it was entirely normal within English to use the expression man to mean the species, the human species. It's not now acceptable in English. Now, humanity exists by difference. Humanity is not animality, and humanity is not divinity. That is, humanity is different from what is below the animal world, animality, and it is different from what is above divinity or spirituality. Humanity carries over from Plato and the ancients. The imagery of the human being is in the middle of the creation, suspended between the material and the spiritual, in the middle. And the word humanity is the word that is used to indicate the difference, what it is that makes men and women different from animals and different from angels. Now, so that humanity is specified by difference. It's not just that there is something that makes a man a man, it's something that makes human beings different from other things. Now, the spelling of human, and this is an interesting point, and I want to try and make it clear, we now spell it H-U-M-A-N, but until the early 18th century, it was usually spelled with an E on it, humane. So, for example, the original printing of John Locke's book, An Essay on Human Understanding, is an essay on humane understanding. Now, in modern English, there is a difference between human and humane. A human is a description of a factual state, the qualities that make a person, a human. Human qualities. And a human person is supposed to have humane qualities, which are the qualities which make them act in a way which respects and has moral relationship to other human beings. That is, humane is an evaluative word. Human and humane. Fact, value. And the origin is actually the same word. And this is very important to my mind, in that the word human is not a descriptive word, in some simple sense. It doesn't just describe certain qualities, factual qualities that a person has. It describes certain ideals that a person is supposed, ideally, to have. That is, reference to human is and always has been not just reference to particular qualities, but to ideals. And hence it's perfectly possible in English to say, he is not fully human. Very strange if you stop and think that human is just a description of a certain state. That's a strange thing to say. It's not fully human. Either is human or not, or has human characteristics or not. But the point is, when you say that somebody is not fully human, you're saying they have not realised the ideals of what it is to be a human being. The word human, like the word humane, is, I want to say, always a normative term. It always it always contains an evaluative representation of what it is good to be as a person. People now talk about humane actions. They sometimes say human action, human aid, or humane action. If they say humane action, they very specifically mean an action that is for the good of people. You can say that with human also can say, well, that was a very human thing to do. It means it took account of the emotional qualities, the dreams of the person. That was very humane. It responded to that particular person in a generous way. If you say that was a very humane thing to do, it means that you deliberately did something to support the life and well-being of another. And you can see this in the use of the word in English. For example, in the late 18th century, 1774, there was founded in London the Royal Humane Society. And what does the Royal Humane Society do? Does anybody know? It's a very... It's not now well known, it still exists. But what it does is train people so that they can rescue people from drowning. It's a society committed to saving people from drowning, from going underwater. A specific society that's committed to the humane activity of preserving people's lives. In a city where people throw themselves into the river. Especially servants, especially female servants. As a society, a humane society, to respond to this problem. And in English, of course, it's very common to talk about something being inhumane. It's very close to the use of the word inhuman or inhumane. It means an action that is against the interests and well-being of the ideals of being a person. Can talk about particular actions or decisions or policies. That's inhumane. Now these qualities that make a human human and make a human and make a human humane are not biological qualities. That is when you refer to the humane character. Person. You're not referring to something biological, you're referring to something embedded in non-material qualities, in character, in mentality, in spirituality, or something, but it is, this language is very not biological, very much not biological. And this usage of the word human and humane is at the root, it's the conceptual root of the notion of the humanities. What are those things that make a human and make a human humane? What are they? The study of what they are is the discipline of the humanities. They are all things based not on biology but on language. On the capacity through language of people to live in societies and to construct a cultural world. not just language, but symbol systems, so that the humanities are the study of the qualities of what it is to be human, based upon the capacity of humans to have symbol systems, and through symbol systems, not just to represent their relationships with each other, but to represent ideals. That is to attempt to be more than they are already, or to become fully human. And this is extremely important for the notion of the humanities, that it's the roots of the disciplines which constitute the studies of the humanities have their foundations as the disciplines studying what differentiates humans from the animals, and humans from divinity, from the spiritual world. And those things which differentiate humans, what makes the difference, are based on the capacity for using symbols, especially language. Hence, the humanities are founded in the disciplines of the study of symbolic action, symbolic activity. I've already mentioned that the humanities translates straightforwardly into humanitarian nauki. And you have this very interesting difference that in English there's no reference to science, whereas in Russian it's a reference to science. And that I tried to explain last week how that has come about. In Russian you also have the word gumani. And this is equivalent to the word humane or humanitarian. Many people, English people now, would use the word humanitarian, and it's equivalent to the word humane. It's an action that is for the well-being of the being of a person. And hence when we talk about a humanitarian agency, as humanitarian aid, or you talk about a humanitarian crisis in the Ukraine or in Syria, in which the crisis involves the suffering to the qualities of what is well-being for a person. Now, let me to explain the origin of the word humanities out of the word human. I turn to, this is the third part of my notes, to the medieval and Renaissance periods, medieval and Renaissance scholarship. Let me remind you a little about the universities, the early universities. Perhaps I'll advertise my book here, so I know that I have published on a history of the humanistic sciences in Russian, published by, in a not very humanitarian way, by the High School of Economics. But if you wish more detail about what I'm talking about now, some of this is available in this textbook. Or it's also in English. Now, the medieval universities at the lower levels taught, as I expect you know, a combination of the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium was the most elementary division of teaching. It consisted of 3 subjects, hence trivium: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And note that 3 foundational subjects of higher education are based on language: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Logic at this time is not logic as we would have it, symbolic logic, but is the logic means the way of arriving at knowledge. On the top of the trivium was the quadrivium, which included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. That is the 4 arithmetically based disciplines: the quantifiable, disciplines, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. By the late medieval period, sometimes there was informal reference under the Latin term literae humaniores to the study of Greek and Roman literature, poetry and rhetoric together. Sometimes this was informally called literae humaniores. And the study of human literary studies was sharply differentiated from divinity. That is, the study of Greek and Roman literature, poetry and rhetoric, set up a precedent, an example of the study of values of cultural achievement, independent of the study of divinity, of God. And of course, the study of classical literature was at all stages a constant challenge to Christianity, because it demonstrated the richness and qualities of a world of human culture that was uninformed by Christianity. Now, this study of the literae humaniores was transformed in the early Renaissance from about 1400, from the early 15th century, in the northern Italian cities, and it was transformed by scholars working in universities of Bologna, Padua, so on, by the recovery and editing and later publication of classical texts, and especially by the new awareness and attention paid to original Greek texts. And the scholars who undertook this work of recovering, recreating accurate knowledge of and publishing ancient texts became known, but later, really in the late 16th century, as the humanists. They became known as the humanists because their scholarly work was devoted to human achievements, not to divine achievements. So that the name humanist separates their activity from the activity of the theologians. And their scholarship was founded in the study of texts, of what had been written. But they did not call themselves the humanists, and this is a somewhat later term, just as the word the Renaissance is a much later term. Renaissance is a term of the 19th century, particularly historians like Jakob Burckhardt. Now, the work of the humanist scholars, these textual scholars of the 15th century, goes back to the recovery of Aristotle in Western Europe from the 12th century, and the growing awareness of the differences between different texts, in particular the differences between texts that were taken directly from Byzantium and texts about the Greek that were known through translation from the Arabic. And there's an extremely intense, long and sophisticated development of scholarship on the basis of the comparison of texts, depending upon which translation route they have come through and which history they have had. And there is a central debate about content and nature of Aristotle's arguments, based upon whether or not the commentaries of the Arabic scholars are valid or not. And that comparative question in the early 15th century sets up many of the scholarly questions about the understanding of the accuracy of texts. Now the comparison and then from the 1470s or so onwards, there is the major intellectual event in Europe of the recovery and translation of the Platonic texts directly from the Greek. And there is, just as there is an major edition of Aristotle based upon the original Greek, published in the 1490s. There is a major edition of Plato, published in Florence in the late 15th century, under the leadership of Marsilio Ficino, funded by the great court of Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. Note the importance by this time of not the university as a setting for scholarship, but the court. And the court, in the late Renaissance, comes to play a central part in the funding, in creating the material circumstances in which the scholarship which founds the modern humanities becomes possible. Now, the actual work of the humanists, the people who are producing the new editions of texts, develops certain techniques, and these techniques become the techniques of the key disciplines of the humanities at this period, philology and history. The key techniques involve judging whether a text is original or has been added by a later generation. Is it an original text or is it a later text? By judging whether what is said in the text is said by direct witnesses of what happened, or by indirect witnesses, and then judging whether a source is, historians would say, a primary source, that is written, does it provide direct record of something, or is it a secondary source, is it a commentator's record of what was originally said? And these three judgments, original, added, direct witness, indirect witness, primary source, secondary source, become the basic technical instruments, methodology of philology and of history. And also of legal systems. And the law, the study of the law, is very much bound up with humanistic scholarship. In one of the very important bodies of texts that passed from Byzantium, from the ancient world into Italy, were the laws of Justinian, dating from the 5th century in the Christian era. And the study of these legal texts became the foundation of modern Western jurisprudence and involved very important studies about the relationship between what all laws share in common, what they show about the condition of being human, and what it is necessary for the right administration of being human. The separation of what is universal from what has been created by local historical conditions that is added on to what is universal. And so it's legal systems that develop a human understanding of the separation between universal claims and local claims in the history of the law. And it is lawyers who lay the foundations for modern historical scholarship. Most famously, François Baudin, who taught at Heidelberg in the 1560s. In his lectures, Baudin's lectures, around about 1560, are often regarded as the kind of defining moment of modern historical scholarship. So, I'm trying to make clear that the growth of disciplined study of non-divine knowledge, based upon the recovery, translation, publication of ancient texts, lays the foundations for a series of scholarly methods which are distinctive in their nature and form the core of what we would know as the humanities. They're all, of course, based upon knowledge of and ways of studying language. This study of language is then given another dimension by the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation placed great emphasis upon the capacity of individuals to read the Bible. And it is, of course, associated with the translation of the Bible from Latin into vernacular languages, into the language of German and of English and other languages at this time. And those very translations were major contributions to the formation of modern European languages. But this, of course, the process of translation required scholarship, that is, the understanding of words and the meaning of texts, and the comparison of different editions of Greek and Hebrew in order to arrive at definitive editions. That is, the Protestant Reformation made the scholarly study of the Bible's word a central discipline of human studies. It widened the scope away from the classical sources into the Bible. And it is usually said that these studies in the early Protestant universities, Marburg or Leiden, for example, laid the foundations for what becomes hermeneutics, the technical study of the processes of interpretation of language. Now, perhaps we could say, this is rather loose, but we could say that the great attempt at a synthesis under the heading The New Science by Giambattista Vico in the early 18th century is in a sense a culmination, the high point of humanist scholarship. Because Vico argues that he has methods for studying language and history, but he argues, as the humanists have done, that it is those methods that actually give us knowledge of what humankind has made of itself. That is, that the study of language and its history is the study of man. And for Vico, this can be turned into a science. And here you have the claim that the foundations for the systematic and disciplined study of the human being lie in the development of the scholarship of the humanities, not in the scholarship of the natural sciences. And it was my attempt to think through what could be made of that very, very large claim that is behind my book on teaching that essentially there could be an argument to found the disciplined study of human beings, not in biology but in language. Now let me move to my fourth point. When the humanists studied classic texts, they didn't just produce new editions. They claimed the value of what they were doing was studying what had separated the civilized Greeks and the Romans from barbarians. That is, the study of the humanities was the study of civilization itself. It's what differentiates progress of the human spirit from lack of progress. It's what separates civilization and barbarism. And this has left a major legacy for the humanities. They are not just the study of a certain area of what humans do. They are the study of what civilized human beings do. That is what makes the existence of human beings justify what represents, it is supposed, the greatest achievements. So that the study of the humanities becomes the study of civilization itself, as it is for Pico. By studying the humanities subjects, one is studying the dignity of the being of a human. It is a highly normative activity. It's a study directed towards values. And here I can make certain comments. Firstly, note the importance of Cicero. Cicero is the classic, best-known classic source for discussion of what constitutes a civilized form of personal existence. And Cicero was read and taught in order to educate people in the qualities of what marks out a civilized man. It was a man from other peoples. Secondly, an education in the classics, an education in Roman Greek literature, such as Cicero, is not just education in the literature, it's education in the models for how to become an educated, a member of the governing class. That is, that the study of the classics becomes the means by which to educate a civilized governing class. And that has really persisted into the 20th century. And even when education in the classics has gone into steep decline, as it did in Great Britain in the early 20th century, it was then replaced by the study of English literature. And in many respects, English literature replaced the study of the classics as the way in which to educate people into being civilized, humane, sensitive people. And English literature, the study of the great writers, has had this perpetuated dysfunction of the earlier teaching of the classics. I don't know whether something can be said about the teaching of Russian literature. I think perhaps it could, in the same way that you do. You may not study Cicero, but you do study Pushkin. And they are sources of what makes a human civilized. And then third comment about teaching of the classics is that it set up comparison between what the ancients, the Greeks and the Romans, had done and achieved, and what modern people could do and could achieve. That is, knowledge of the classics made it possible to compare past and present, and hence to judge progress. And there was a large debate in literature at the end of the 17th century called ancients versus the moderns. Those who said that the ancients had reached a level of literature which had not been overtaken, and the moderns who said, we have overtaken the ancients. That is, the humanities gave a criterion, made it possible to imagine a criterion for judging civilization. And judgment that European culture was civilized in a way that other cultures were not was, of course, the European-centered basis for the assertion of European world dominance. That is, the humanities are, in a sense, the cultural attempt, provide the cultural legitimacy for the European assertion of cultural superiority, which went with construction of empire, Russian, British, whatever. Now, I think it's important that many of the ideals that are embodied in classical education taught by humanists continue to be embodied in teaching in the 20th century, even after classical education is marginalised, particularly through study of English literature, but generally through the teaching of the humanities. That in a sense, modern teaching in the humanities is a democratised version of traditional elite teaching in the classics. That the same underlying values are present. They are concerned with the education of people in civilized forms of cultural existence. And hence also the claim that the humanities do something in teaching which the natural sciences do not. And there have been many debates in Britain about the relative value of an education within the natural sciences or within the humanities. A famous one, late 19th century debate between Matthew Arnold, a poet, and T.H. Huxley, a biologist. And that debate was repeated in the 1950s and 1960s in Britain around what's called the two cultures. And it's a debate about what is the respective value of teaching students natural sciences and humanities. And the humanities argument is that it teaches people civilized values. And that was particularly important, it was thought, when the universities were in the business of training the future leaders of the country, as was the case in Oxford, still is the case in Oxford. Very large percentage of the present government were Oxford trained. This has been true of many prime ministers in Britain. And it was thought that a classical or modern humanities education was appropriate for teaching character, the real values of morality, practical values of morality, to those men who would go on to be the leaders of the country. Note that this is a very different kind of defence of the value of a particular student study from it will be useful. The debate between use and humanistic value has a very long and deep and rich history in the English-speaking world. Now, in this context, I must notice, and try to make this clear for you, a source of confusion. I I've been talking about the humanists as the people who study the texts and then teach. But the word acquires a new meaning in the last part of the 19th century, a second meaning, humanist. And it comes to mean a person who believes in humanity as the highest value. Humanist as opposed to atheist, or humanist as opposed to theist. So a modern humanist is a person who doesn't believe in God, but believes in the ideals of humanity. In 1896, the British Humanist Association was founded. It was a union of ethical societies committed to devoted to the study and education of people in human values, but not in divine values. And the person now who says he's a humanist, like the famous popular exponent of science, Richard Dawkins, for example, would describe himself as a humanist. He's opposed to believing in God, but he believes in humanity. He doesn't study texts like the traditional humanists. So you have to be clear, when you hear the word humanist or the word humanism, which is being talked about, to study texts in the traditional way, or somebody who's asserting a particular belief system, which excludes God, but centers upon the religion of humanity. Now, the notion of the humanities is further enriched by what happens in the German universities from the late 18th century. The German universities, the changes that happen there are then followed by other countries, including Britain and especially the United States, in the latter part of the 19th century. Just as the Russian universities and Scandinavian also follow a basic German model. And that German model, the change that takes place in the German universities at the end of the 18th century, is the expansion of the universities from the three traditional faculties, theology, law, and medicine, to the growth of the fourth faculty, the philosophy faculty. And the philosophy faculty then becomes enormously enlarged to include all the disciplines of the modern Wissenschaft, the modern sciences, the natural sciences, social sciences, and the humanities. And this process of the division of the university into a series of disciplines under the philosophy faculty begins in German universities in the late 18th century. And the two disciplines that most clearly separate themselves and establish the modern notion of a discipline with a professor and a seminar in which students train in the methods which have been demonstrated by the professor. That disciplinary practice through the seminar, training in the discipline, is first clearly demonstrated in the disciplines of philology and then in history. So the discipline of philology, in a way, is the first discipline of the modern university. And figures like Franz Bopp at the University of Berlin and in studying philology, and Niebuhr, who's a historian of Roman history, established famous seminars which become the models of what is done within a research university. And those models are then followed later by outside of the German-speaking world. In the German-speaking world, as I emphasised last week, all these disciplines are called sciences, Wissenschaft. And they are called sciences in the English-speaking world until the early 20th century. But further within the universities, this creation of the modern structure of disciplines occurs in a cultural setting which emphasises learning, scholarship, the activity of universities as the figurehead, as having a leadership position within the culture. And the German universities changed just at the time when Napoleon humiliates and defeats Prussia militarily, and the lack of unity, political unity of the German-speaking world is compensated for by an assertion of the cultural superiority of the German-speaking world, unified by its language, and unified in its thinking by the great achievements of Kant, of Hegel, by the philological scholars like Bopp and Grimm, and by its historians and lawyers and so on. And an education, higher education, therefore becomes the vehicle, the embodiment of the ideals of the German-speaking peoples. And those ideals are given institutional form and the foundation of the University of Berlin in 1809-1810 under the leadership of Wilhelm von Humboldt. And education then is not just, in the German-speaking world, not just the acquisition of certain techniques, but it's the formation of a civilized, unified person. You get the development of the conceptual notion of Bildung, formation, wholeness. Education is not just acquiring a bit of learning, it's becoming a certain kind of person, and that kind of person is the highest representative of humanity. It embodies the educated person, the person with Bildung embodies humanity. And so in the German-speaking academic culture, the humanities disciplines become associated with the highest ideals of humanity. I think this is very important, that the professor in philosophy, in the arts, in the history of the arts, in history of language, in philology, is the figurehead of civilization. And this leads to the German sense of itself as providing leadership in civilization. It is legitimated by the quality of its universities and its education system. In the late 19th century Germany, there are then many debates about the relative contributions of the disciplines, which ones actually do most for culture, what's the place of philosophy in relation to the specialist sciences, what are the special virtues of the natural sciences, and so on. These debates are not debates about science versus humanities, but are debates about Naturwissenschaften versus Geisteswissenschaften, and debates about what is the place of philosophy. I don't actually know and can't give you an account of the details of when the humanities becomes the common term for these disciplines in the English-speaking world. But my understanding is, and I can be corrected on this, is that it happens in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. Now, that's my history. I'm going to conclude now, very briefly, by making some comments, and you may wish to comment on my comments, about what is distinctive about the humanities disciplines. Firstly, they are text-based. And if they treat visual materials, they treat visual materials as texts. Film or dance is treated as a text. And they are the disciplines concerned with the technical skills grounded in philology, hermeneutics and logic and history for studying texts. Secondly, they are the disciplines qualitative in their forms of argument, not quantitative. Thirdly, the humanities disciplines have a very problematic, questionable relationship with the search for general laws. Certainly in the 19th century, philologists and historians searched for general laws. And in the 20th century, the linguists have certainly done so. There are formal systems which claim to find general ways of framing the understanding of language. But in modern humanities, this is widely rejected. And many people turn to the distinction introduced by the rector of the University of Freiburg in 1894, Wilhelm Windelband, who drew a distinction in forms of knowledge. And some of you will know these technical words between nomothetic and ideographic forms of understanding. Nomothetic is based on law-like understanding, and ideographic is forms of understanding based on individual cases. And for many people, the humanities are those disciplines concerned with the particular, with the individual cases, with ideographic forms of understanding. Note the spelling of ideographic. It's I-D-I-O. It shares a root with the word idiosyncratic in English. It's what is particular. It's not to do with ideas, it's to do with what is particular, what is individual. The fourth characteristic of the humanities is that they have often been justified by their value for teaching. They have status because of what they teach. This is firstly true because what the humanities do is act as the memory of civilization. What they teach is what is being thought to be civilized. They pass it on to the next generation. Their concern is not truth or utility or religion, but civilization. Secondly, they are held to train the mind. This is traditional teaching Latin and Greek. It's taught because it trains the mind. And thirdly, and this is a large claim full of controversy, is that the humanities have often been held to teach the virtues. That it is by studying the humanities that a person becomes a good character. By studying the novel, the sensitive novel, Eugene Onegin, we understand the difference between what counts as an authentic expression of an emotional life, what counts as a virtuous character, and what does not, what counts as a moral failure in a person's life. We've been reading in English class The Merchant of Venice. Reading The Merchant of Venice Shakespeare's play and engage with the moral dilemma of the relationship between justice and mercy. It's by studying the humanities that we are able to talk about the relationship of justice and mercy. So the defense goes. Well, let me read you finally a quotation from a recent writer defending the humanities. There's quite a large literature, current literature in English on defending the humanities. People are trying to say in language which is clear enough for politicians to understand why you should pay money for the humanities. And of course it's a challenging thing to do. Now listen to this list. I'll try and read it slowly and clearly. The humanities inculcate, that means they introduce students to, the humanities introduce students to, often enough through attention to works of art, and this is often through art. 1, a sense of other minds and cultures. 2, humanities require and reward attention to formal and textual features, as well as to literal or manifest meaning. That is, they show how the forms of language are structured, how art forms are created, and don't just attend to straightforward meaning. They show the riches of language. 3, the humanities invite individual interpretation and influence. They invite the individual to take part in debate. 4, they cultivate the faculty of judgment. They require you to take decisions about what is good or right. 5, they awaken a sense of values. They awaken a sense of values. 6, they engage the emotions as well as the intellect. They involve the emotions as well as the intellect. 7, they enlarge our imaginative capacities. 8, they challenge, deepen, and enrich our understanding of the world. 9, they provide fertile ground for the growth of self-knowledge. We don't just learn about the world, we learn about ourselves. And 10, this is the most controversial part, and under the right circumstances, the humanities open the way to tolerance, restraint, humility, and even wisdom.